maybe we'll be able to discuss them a bit more in depth and a bit more cohesively here.
Yes, yeah, I want to dig deeper into, Paul had your quote as the title of this episode. And that was really what caught my attention when you said emergence is the greatest get out of jail free card that the scientists have come across. And when I heard you say that, I thought, okay, he has come to that conclusion because he's been doing some study and he's been looking into things. And so it made me wonder, what is it in your life that led you to the place that you started looking into those things and you decided to try to make some discoveries about it?
Well, to be honest, I think I've always had this question. Maybe not, I wasn't able to articulate it in so many words, but I've had like there used to be this question I used to pull out in physics class, and in hindsight, it was a bit of a cruel question to ask teachers who are paid next to nothing in India, like literally next to nothing. But my friends would goad me into asking this question just if they wanted the period to be killed or the class to be killed, just like for us, for the entire class, time of the class to be wasted, they'd ask me to ask this question, and that was, okay, so we have, I mean, it's going to sound really childish and simplistic now, but actually this was the beginning of my interest in this particular question. But I'd say, okay, and you stack up, you say everything is made up of atoms, and ultimately atoms are made up of protons, electrons, neutrons, quarks. But at the end, it's fundamentally everything is made of the same substance or the same fundamental particle. And yet, if I stacked up a billion chairs, I'm not magically going to have some new reality be unlocked at some new level arbitrarily. Yet somehow with these fundamental particles, every time they're so magical, for lack of a better word, that every time they're arranged in certain different permutations, they seem to unlock some new properties of the universe, and properties which aren't like already encoded into them, because what's happening at an emergent level is never really and is not really described by the interactions that they have at their local level. Mm-hmm. So that was literally the question I had ever since I was a kid. I never got it, but back then I thought, well, I'm sure people have looked into this. I'm sure, like, if I, a mere child, could ask this question, I'm sure there have been lots of other smart people who have probed this question. But that was pretty much the beginnings of this question, and I don't think I've ever had it sufficiently answered since then.
Yeah, that's a funny thing. I think there are a lot of questions like that in the universe where, I mean, I'm not a scientist. My husband's a technology guy, and I think he's brilliant. Of course, he's my husband, right? But he often sees things in the industry that seem to me to be brilliant insights, and I don't see them anywhere else. And so I'll say to him, well, why don't you tell somebody about that? And he says, well, if I can think of it, surely someone else has already thought of it long ago. But nobody else has talked about it. They haven't seen it. So how do you know that they know? Until you start asking, you don't know that they know, right? And so I appreciate the fact that you decided to go after it. And so you've been doing some research on it, and have you come to any conclusions?
Well, I should clarify. When I say, like, as with the title in Paul's video, when I say emergence is the biggest get out of jail free card, I think a lot of people took it for me, like in the comment section, a lot of people, Carl especially, took it to mean that I don't believe in emergence. It's not that I don't believe in emergence. It's just that within the paradigm of a physicalist or a materialist, mm-hmm. I just find it completely incongruent, and like it doesn't cohere with their overall belief system. Because this is, I mean, there's no way to describe it other than some sort of a non-physical phenomenon, or like it's something which isn't encoded into the physics of the constituent units. So I should clarify that I'm not denying emergence. I just don't believe that it's consistent for a physicalist or a materialist to adhere to such a view. And
what usually occurs to me is that it doesn't, to say something is emergent doesn't explain anything.
Yes.
They just say, oh, well, it's emergent. oh, okay. And so how does it emerge? How does it get here from there? No, it's enough to just say it's emergent, because that's a magic word. Once you say it's emergent, you don't have to explain anything anymore. That's what I always wonder, because yes, it's obvious to see that there is such a thing as a complex dynamical system, and there are chaos theory and all those things are absolutely real. But why does it work? Well, not even so much why, how does it work that way? And even Cy Garth this morning, when I was talking to him, he brought that up, and he's worked a lot at the very fundamental levels of biochemistry, looking at origin of life and theoretical biology. And he also says whenever they start using the word emergent, it's a magic word. They never say, anything else. It's just, that's obvious. It's emergent, and that's all you need to say, right?
I'm so glad there are people like in that field with so much actual knowledge. I mean, not actual knowledge. We should put down our layman, delving into these issues. But like, I'm glad that there are people who are actually in the fields who are able to wrestle with these problems, and it's not just something that people can look at us and say, you just don't understand the science. Because that's the easiest thing for someone who's an expert to say, oh, you just don't understand it. If you actually looked into it, you'd be able to understand it. But what I will cling to always is that ultimately everything is going to be understood in terms of some sort of a metaphysic, regardless of the complexity of the stuff. Even the most complex mathematics, if we had enough time, we are still going to understand it based on some sort of a metaphysical explanation, some deep. There is something in us which is capable of grasping it, which is probably the point I brought up right at the beginning of my conversation with Paul. Because regardless of how complex, how dynamic, regardless of how complex the system is, ultimately, it's not self-evident that any of this emergence should occur in any of these systems just because of the complexity. And on top of that, there is the issue that complexity itself, I don't know how you could ontologically give a definition for complexity. Epistemologically, we can say that there's complexity or complicated system, but that's only from the viewpoint of any particular observer, or in this instance, humans. What if there is another entity to whom what we would call complex is not even complex? It's just like as self-evident as 1 + 1 is to us. So
just
there's a question of that.
Frame. You mean it just depends on the frame?
Yes, just depends.
Yeah. If you're looking at the ground of being, who has the biggest frame, then it's not complex to him at all, because he knows exactly where it's going.
Yeah, I mean, of course, if we're talking about the ground of being or God,
yeah.
But even let's not, without even jumping to the level of God, because it could be anything. Just for the sake of the secular-minded folk out there, let's just say another life form for whom we could look at two sides of the spectrum. There could be one side of the spectrum where things which are self-evident to us are very complicated for another life form. Or there could be another sort of life form of consciousness where that which is so complex to us is it's the easiest. It's just like, well, duh. It's just duh to them. It could be so complexity itself is not a good enough definition for people to use that as a get out of jail card. Oh, it's just when things get so complex, when information exchange gets so complex, consciousness emerges. Why? Is there some sort of a truly, the word objective is so loaded, but truly, I don't know what other word I could use in its place, but a truly objective way of saying this is complex and this is not? Which frame are you going to invoke to define this term complexity in a non-changing way?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to look at it. One of the other things that you said that I thought was really interesting was you said what lies at the apprehension at the surface of any topic in science and math? What lies just below the surface? All philosophy, all science, all math, there is a presumption that we can apprehend it.
Yeah.
And I wondered if that was what you were just getting at now, that the very fact that we're able to think these complex thoughts and apprehend these things is itself part of that emergence and causation kind of conundrum.
Yeah, that's a big part of it, because again, this is another question which a lot of people don't, they just take for granted. Like why, it's kind of tied in with the question which is somewhat discussed in, and again, not in like most popular scientific circles, but it's still kind of discussed where they say the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics.
Yes.
It's kind of tied into that, but it's kind of beyond that or like below that. It's like, why should we be able to apprehend anything in the first place? And what is the difference from us looking at numbers and equations on a page? I mean, of course, this is to a trained person, but what is the difference? What is the switch which happens from when we're just seeing the numbers in the equations and we don't really get it, we can see what it means, and then suddenly it clicks. What is that switch that happens? Of course, somebody's going to jump in with some sort of a facile explanation like, oh, that's just your neural synapses syncing up or whatever, but we'll get into that later. That's just, but metaphysically speaking, what is the difference? What is the difference in the app between just seeing the numbers and apprehending it? And I mean, this is a person who knows all the principles leading up to this point. There's no new principle or axiom or information they need. And yet there is some switch where they go from not apprehending to apprehending. And even at the most base level with our axioms, why are certain things self-evident? Like we can explain, we can reduce to a point. But at a point, we rely on this innate ability in any other human to apprehend. So we're just kind of guiding them. And some people, of course, we call someone a genius or talented when they are able to apprehend without having things to be reduced more. All the pathways just form innately for some people in certain spheres. But this apprehension is definitely a mysterious thing.
Well, so that makes me think of a couple things. The first thing that pops into mind is Mark Twain's famous comment when he visited Germany. He said, wow, those German children are so smart. They all can speak German.
Exactly.
And I studied linguistics for my graduate work. And one of the things they taught us was that babies who grow up in bilingual households are hearing both languages. And then when they begin to speak, if they grow up with English and Chinese, the English words will come out in English sentences and the Chinese words will come out in Chinese sentences. The English words, they'll be using English grammar. The Chinese words, they'll be using Chinese grammar. So there's a little black box in their brains that works things out before they begin to speak. Now, you're talking about a year-old child, okay? There's been no input there. There's been nobody teaching them, well, this is English grammar and you have to do it this way, and here's the rules of speaking Chinese, but it's already there. How can that be?
I'm an ESL teacher, so like we're always trying to like hack into that. I mean, it's not my greatest passion and thing, but it's currently what I'm doing. But like even then, I try and bring in some of this thought. I'm like, I'm sure there's something in there where you can hack into that part of the brain which is still there, or maybe it's gone from childhood where people just understand rules like that because
well,
it's so alien.
It goes with puberty.
Once it's gone.
Well, it gets less with puberty. If you have learned another language before puberty, it's kind of activated your language acquisition center. But if you have never learned another language and then you get past puberty, it's going to be much more difficult for you to learn a second language. And if you learn a language before puberty, you're going to have much less problem with the accent. You'll be able to speak it with a native accent. But when you learn it after puberty, and so I don't know why that's the magic spot, but that's what they taught us.
Oh, I see. So it's gone. In most likely, I'm trying to appeal to some part of them which is long gone. But I kind of lost my train of thought at that point. But yeah.
Well, a lot of it has to do with motivation too with your students. So just hang in there. They'll get there. When you were talking about causation and emergence, at one point you said, well, if we interfere, it morphs one way. If we interfere again, it morphs another way. And so you were talking about agency and causation. And I've been having a discussion on one of the comment threads with somebody about agency and causation, and I tend to think that, and probably maybe because I don't understand enough about philosophy, but when I think about causation, I think there must be an agent. But this person I'm talking to says, well, no, causation does not indicate the necessity of agency. And I wondered how you thought about that.
So I'm just assuming that this person would be referring to causation in the traditional sense, where one event which leads to another event causes that event. But what I was, from my perspective, the way I frame it, okay, so I'm going to take, this is not my worldview, but this is something I always have to preface before I say something. But the first thing I would say is from their worldview. Okay, so they have this worldview where certain events cause other events. And again, that's something they're trying to, that seems so self-evident to them because they're apprehending it from their frame, the human frame, that it, yeah, of course, this event cannot happen unless this event happens. But now let's zoom out of their worldview and just see what everything is. Like, let's zoom out of time, let's just zoom completely out and see that all we have are correlated events. I don't even want to use them events. We just have perfectly correlated events from the inception of time, from the Big Bang, whatever, till the present day and extending into the indefinite future, regardless of what kind of physics we're invoking. It's all just perfectly correlated. In this picture, without invoking an agent, all we ever have is correlation. There's never causation. We can't say that this event caused that event, because what does it mean to say that? It's just that all the events are linked in this way, which is unchangeable. It's only if we bring in an agent who can invoke a hypothetical situation, even in his mind, even if he doesn't physically affect whatever, even if he doesn't physically affect something out there in the world, it's only in the hypothetical space that we can even talk about causation, because otherwise it's just correlation. Someone has to go in and gerrymander with the system in order to see how the system responds once it's been altered, once it's been tampered with, and then keep doing that. And then you still need a mind at the end of all of that to then abstract out a principle by which it morphs in all of these different situations. So the notion of causation, because we have this ability to apprehend through our internal experience of agency what it means to cause something. This would not have happened had I not done this. That's what causation means. This would not have happened had I not done that. And there's a further problem there, which is agency. If there are a chain of events, agency has the ability to jump the line, so to speak. Because perhaps if Paul talks about things that go on their own, in the spirit of things going on their own, it could be such that in order for this event to happen, an entire chain of events has to happen. Yet it's only an agent who can jump in arbitrarily at any stage, any point of the chain, and kind of jumpstart the event by coming in at this part of the chain before this event, as opposed to having to start there. So there's no way to talk about causation without an agent. In my view, I think it's metaphysically impossible.
Mm-hmm. Wow, my brain just
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's really good, but I just it's going to take me a second to rein it in, because I'm thinking about so many different things. I was thinking about chaos theory and the butterfly effect, and how that ties into the complex dynamical systems, and how the starting condition is the precision of the starting condition is what's essential for what happens after that. And in chaos theory, when they discovered that if they change the starting condition by even a tiny minute amount, then it can result in chaos rather than in the result that you're looking for. And but the other thing that came to my mind is this videotape I watched of a Dr. Sharon Glotzer, and she is a PhD in materials physics, particle physics, materials.
Sharon?
Sharon Glotzer, Glotzer. I think you'd really like it. And she and her team are putting together lots of different combinations of these tiny little nanoparticles that are manufactured particles. They're not natural organic particles. They're manufactured out of some sort of synthetic material. And she was talking about, in one experiment, they took a bunch of these particles and they put them in a confined space, and then they began to remove all of the space around them until they had removed all the space and there was nothing there but particles. And she said at that point, when they had removed all the space, the particles naturally went into a perfect crystalline formation. And then she said, and this all happened with nothing but entropy. And the instant she said that, and I mean, I'm not a physicist, but the instant she said that, I thought, no, dear, it wasn't just entropy. You were an agent who removed all the space. You changed the boundary. And because I'm an artist, the boundary is like super essential to the final design. So I knew that the boundary was important. You can't just say that I changed the boundary, but that doesn't count. It was just entropy. No, it wasn't just entropy. You were an agent and you interfered. I mean, the agent shows up every time there's an observer, right? There's the observer effect in quantum physics. You can't get away from that. So anyway, I just think they're kind of
No, for sure.
very smart, but they're also very funny.
I think what happens with a lot of people who are like, it's just that people have learned physics and mathematics and they've got to a high level of sophistication in those disciplines. And they've done so without ever being taught philosophy and the philosophy of science and metaphysics side by side. So they reach certain points where it's almost like you're trying, and it's almost like extracting information from not all of them. There are, of course, insightful scientists and mathematicians, but extracting insight from some of them is kind of like asking a genius pianist to explain like what they're doing, someone who's learned it since they're a kid. So much of it is a patchwork of second nature, intuition, along with the formal understanding that it's hard for them to pass this apart. And when you ask just a fairly simple question to you, right, it's like, what are you talking about? We didn't do anything. What is this boundary you're talking about? It's just it just happened because of whatever, because of entropy.
Yeah. Well, so I saw this quote today. I saw this quote online from Albert Einstein, and I thought it was pretty good. He said, "Perfection of means and confusion of goals. In my opinion, that's what seems to characterize today's age. Perfection of means and confusion of goals." And that's kind of what you're talking about with the scientists. And then I was watching this video of George Ellis. When I talked to Dr. Cy Gart this morning, he mentioned this George Ellis, who is a cosmologist, who actually worked with Stephen Hawking. And so he, kind of a smart guy. So this George Ellis, there's a number of really good interviews with him on YouTube. And one of the things that he said is that he sees the scientists trying to take over ethics. And that's a big problem because they're not familiar enough with the philosophy of ethics. So they introduce simplistic concepts of the good life and how their science is going to lead to morality. But he says morality is built into the stuff of the universe, and you can't devise a morality and impose it because there already is an ethical principle that's there, just like the mathematical principles and the principles of physics. And he said that physicists need to take a broader view that physical causation is not the only causation taking place. There are many other causations, such as logical causation in biology and mental causation. So I think he was also talking about expanding the frame. I think that's what he was getting at there, the need to expand the frame.
And this logical causation is another very interesting area because again, like when people talk about emergent systems, going back to emergence, when people talk about emergent systems, like for instance, let me try and see if I'm going to get this right. If I get it wrong, forgive me. But ants, without communicating in any way with their fellow ants, the ants take the shortest pathway to the food, because just by emergence, just because all the other pathways fade out, the ants who took the longer pathways, they die. The smell or the pheromones die out quicker than on the path which is the shortest path. So by default, it emerges that the ants follow the shortest pathway to food.
Mhm.
Again, there's a lot of logic that happens there. There's a lot of logical entailment. We just, when I say that story, it seems so self-evident to us. Oh, of course, all the longer pathways, they fade out a long time before so the ants who take the longer pathways end up not reaching the food or reaching the food later, and the ants who take the shortest pathway, of course, they're the ones who get to the food, and that gets reinforced because once one ant goes there, the pheromone pathway gets stronger and stronger. But again, there's a lot of logic built into that. Why is it assumed that reality, first of all, how does reality select that logic is now going to start applying at the level of ants? Why did it stop applying? Like, does the reality know that there are these different levels? If, I don't know if let me see if I can phrase this correctly. If reality only has, in the ultimate reductionist physical view of reality, if reality only has one basic set of laws, then how does, which is, let's just, for instance, let's for now say it's quantum physics. How does reality, or whatever, how does whatever the reality it is that they are positing, know that now we have skipped to a higher level of reality, and this level of reality is called biology and ants. And now logic can start applying here, such that we can comprehend that there is a system here. Am I? Does it like? Am I like?
Yeah, no, I'm following you. I'm totally following you, but at the same time, I'm thinking about this discussion I heard about, because I've got in my mind this whole thing about emergence and dynamical systems theory, and I'm thinking about this guy that was talking about ants and how they follow the leader, and so they're going down the shortest path, but there's always a little bit of randomness, because if there's not the randomness, then if something interferes in this line of ants, if a human being steps down and a bunch of ants get killed in the line, the ones in the back are not going to be able to figure out where the path is anymore. So the line of ants always has a few scouts out on the perimeter that have a broader view of the path, and they're out here. And so if somebody comes and steps in the middle of the path, those guys out on the outside, they can see, oh, I see where we are up ahead, and they go tell everybody else, or they just get in line themselves so that people in the back can see again. I mean, so the ants in the back can see again. Now, maybe I'm telling the story wrong, because the way I'm telling it, I'm giving brains to these ants, and it's probably just instinct or logic, or I don't know what it is that makes the ants go, but it's certainly more than just particle physics, deterministic, making things happen. Why do there happen to be these ants that are out on the perimeter that are acting as scouts?
I'm sure someone's going to come up with, or someone already has come up with some sort of a deterministic agency expelling version of that. I'm sure. I mean,
oh yes, I'm sure they have too.
Yeah. So, but the deeper question for them still is why? How does logic know which level to operate in? Like, why should it happen? Why should this sequence happen logically? Why can't reality just do something else? Why does it have to?
Well, because logic is not happening. We know it's not happening at the quantum level, right?
Yeah.
Because the quantum level is all stochastic. It's all randomness. So it's not happening at the quantum level. So at what level does it start operating?
Exactly.
Why?
And
if there is a level at which it starts operating, then is logic something that's built into the fundamental stuff of the universe, or is it something that human beings are the only ones? Did we did we discover or invent logic, right?
Exactly.
And so I think those are like the deep questions.
And if we invented it, there's no reason why any explanation of emergence, why we should accept any explanation of emergence which does away with the agent. If we invented logic, just because it logically makes sense to us that the ants are following the shortest path because of so and so logical progression, why should we accept that logical progression?
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason for us to accept it if we just purely invented it. And I don't even understand what invent means from a physicalist universe. Like when a physicalist or like a new atheist says, "Oh, we just came up with this idea or we invented it," like even truth and falsehood have no meaning in a completely physical universe because it's all just phenomena. They might say no, some utterances which are physical phenomena bear a closer resemblance to the truth. But again, like the truth as abstracted by which mind? It's just a big mess. I think it's just it's just an epistemological dilemma that one way of thinking which has led to these absurdities has been so powerful in terms of impacting the world around us that it's so hard for us to now shelve that and accept that there are other things going on as well.
Well, so I was thinking about this whole thing of how they, can't remember exactly what it was that you just said, but what you just said, I had a mental assent. Yes, 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 because besides that, there is also this issue of the binary, that everything is so binary. Oh, that for them, truth is what is falsifiable, verifiable, testable, empirically testable, and all of that, right? That's what truth is for them. But that still leaves them with, if that's what they truly believe, then they do have a concept of truth. So if there is a truth, there is also the opposite of truth. So you're in the binary again. And then we also have yes and no as binaries, and we have the zeros and ones as binaries. And for some reason, everything operates on this binary, which indicates to me that good and evil are a binary that are also existent in the universe. Because, you know, Jordan Peterson says that you cannot move forward if you don't have some sort of value structure, that you have to value something, one thing more than another in order to be able to move forward. Without that, there are too many choices to be made. The universe in front of you has infinite number of choices, and you can't possibly choose unless you have a value structure. Well, once you have a value structure, that means one thing is better than another thing. And if something is better than something else, then something is better than that and better than that. And then you're going to go all the way up to the top, to the ultimate good, and all the way down to the bottom to the ultimate bad. It has to be that way. I don't see any way out of that. And yet scientists seem to want to just ignore that whole landscape and see everything as just, you know, it's just all particles. And because I just don't see how they get past the binary, because the binary is everywhere.
And I think like in their for them, for their ontology of everything being particles is kind of like their mythology, kind of like the mythology that religious people like Christians, I mean, I'm Christian, and you can kind of see the parallel in the way like.
Okay, when you said that, I missed it because you got a little bit muffly.
Oh, sorry.
Mythology of what?
I said, and the ontology that scientific realists have, where everything is just particles, that's kind of just their grounding mythology. Because when they speak of other topics, they do not invoke this worldview. Otherwise, they wouldn't be talking about, oh, I'm hungry. They would be giving a particle physics description of what I am hungry means. They wouldn't just say I'm hungry. Nor would they talk about, oh, you should have done that. That would be a nonsensical statement to them. And yet everyone acts. We are forced to act by virtue of being humans, as if all of these other levels of reality are existent. And of course, it's just their mythology that this is just emergent. And that's where I bring in, for those people, emergence is their get out of jail card. Because no one acts as if it's purely just particle physics. No one talks that way. No one speaks.
Mm-hmm.
You could just speak, just don't, if you want to be so true, Of course, they'll say, no, pragmatically, we're just adopting this language. But then it's not true, because your ultimate standard for truth, that which is ultimate descriptive of the universe. You don't get to have these other gradations.
You're breaking up again. Your
Oh.
ultimate standard for truth is what?
Oh. Is it better now?
Yeah, I think it just happened. It happens when you move forward and start talking really fast.
I should stop getting excited.
So you were saying your ultimate standard for truth is?
Again, for the scientific realist, the ultimate standard for truth is that which is the ultimate reductionist reality of particle physics. Then, if that is if that is their definition of truth, then they don't get to then have all these other gradations of truth, which are not consistent with their metaphysical presuppositions at the beginning. Because all of the other levels of truth, where we talk about the truth or the goodness of an action or the prudence of an action or any of that stuff, or moral consistency, they do not get to employ this language because it's not consistent with their metaphysical worldview. Whereas for someone who has a spiritual worldview and everything is not completely reductionist and there's a top-down aspect as well, you do get to be consistent and have all of these other levels of truth and other ways of talking about truth other than just particle physics. But from their perspective, it's not consistent for them to have these different realms of truths.
Well, so before you started studying all of this, Arul, where were you in your thinking? I mean, how did you grow up? Did you grow up with a belief in an ultimate ground of being, or is this something you've come to as an adult?
Again, so I did grow up Methodist, so I grew up in the Christian church in India.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a really young child, of course, probably till the age of 10, it was pretty simplistic in my mind, other than some of these lingering questions, which I, of course, just put off, as I'm sure people have got this worked out. But yeah, once I started at the age of 10, really, when I moved to India, actually, I grew up in Scotland. When I was till the age of 10, I was in Scotland, though my accent now is completely Indian. I lost it. So much for the.
Did you have a Scottish accent before?
Yeah, as a child, I had a Scottish accent.
I would love to hear that.
I wish it would come back. It would definitely make for a better accent. But yeah, so.
Have you ever read any George MacDonald?
No.
Oh, okay. I think you would like George MacDonald.
Okay.
He's a wonderful author of the 19th century.
Okay.
And he was actually one of the forerunners of C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis looks to George MacDonald as one of his mentors because he read all of George MacDonald's work.
Then I've definitely got to read it.
Yeah, but George MacDonald wrote a lot of novels. He also wrote a lot of sermons and a lot of essays, but he also wrote a lot of novels. And his novels are in Scotland, and very deep Scottish brogue in the dialogues of the people. And so back in the 1970s, 1980s, there was a guy that decided to transliterate those works into modern English and then republish the books in modern English so that you could actually read that stuff.
George MacDonald.
George MacDonald.
MacDonald is easy enough to remember.
I think it's M-A-C and then
Okay.
Donald. MacDonald. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, he had a wonderful, winsome spirit, really, really beautiful, tender heart, and he wrote a lot of. I read probably half a dozen, maybe 8 of his novels when I was first a new believer, and it was really fundamental in the way that I kind of looked at the world.
Did you grow up a believer, or did that happen?
No, I grew up in a home where I think my mother's parents had been churchgoers, but maybe Christmas and Easter churchgoers. And then my father's parents, I think, were probably, I'm not sure that they were atheists, but as far as I know, there wasn't any belief at all. So when I was growing up, my dad was very against any sort of belief at all. And he made sure that my brother never got any sort of background at all in faith. But I was growing up during the 1960s, and during that time, they used to have something called release time at the school. So every Wednesday afternoon, you'd get out of school an hour early, and you'd go to the church, whatever your church was. You know, you'd go to your own church, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And then you'd get instruction in the faith of whatever your church was. And because my mother's mother had been Methodist, she signed me up to go to the Methodist church. And so I went there every Wednesday afternoon when I was, probably 5th, 6th, 7th grade, something like that. Then I didn't have much to do with church again at all. And I didn't get anything of what they were talking about. It was all, they're talking all about church history and who the Wesleys were. And they didn't talk about Jesus at all. And then when I was in high school, I was in the choir. And the choir director was this really wonderful, kind man. He was probably the kindest person that I'd run into in my life. And I just adored him. I really looked up to him. And he was the choir director at the Lutheran church. So I wanted to be in the Lutheran choir so I could sit under his tutelage. And in order to do that, you had to go through the Lutheran catechism instruction. So I went through that, and I learned all about Luther, but I still didn't learn anything about Jesus. So I went off into the world in college and dabbled in a whole bunch of weird stuff. I had friends that were into witchcraft, and I mean, I was just kind of out there. And it was the hippie era, so I didn't hear anything about faith in the environment I lived in, nobody was Christians. When I was in college, there wasn't any believers around that I knew of. But when I was 30 years old, I went through a period of anxiety because I began to look at what deep trouble the world was in. I could see that at that point, it was 1978, and the United States economy was in a tatters, just falling apart, and I was very concerned about that. So I was reading books on economics and history and trying to figure out what was happening and how to fix it, and I was writing letters to the editor, and I was thinking, if I just get involved enough, I can transform the world, And at a certain point, I just threw up my hands and I said, man, this is bigger than I am. It's such a big problem. I don't have any solution. And I remember one night just railing at the sky saying, God, if there's a God out there, you got to do something. I can't handle this. And I fell asleep that night in tears. And a few days later, I went to a conference on political organizing, and I met a guy there, and I was asking him some questions, and he could kind of tell that I had all this anxiety. And he looked at me and he said, Karen, you know what you need? You need to go to a Bible believing church. I said, what's that? I had no idea. I didn't know anything about the Bible. And but I went back to the house. I was staying with a friend at her house because I was in the big city away from home. And I said what this guy told me, and she said, oh, I think I've heard of one of those. I think I might have been to one with my mom at some point. So do you want to go tomorrow? And I said, sure. So we went to this Bible believing church, and it was so different than any church I'd ever been in. Instead of being dark with everybody sitting in the back and trying to get out as quick as they could, it was all light and bright, and it was a really big place, and the people the husbands and wives had their arms around each other, and there was a lot of joy in the music. And I thought, man, what is this? This is different than anything I've ever seen. And one of the things I had run into in my research was this thing called secular humanism, and how the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies had all this material that I'd been reading on how they wanted to capture the minds and hearts of the children of America and turn them into global citizens. And when I read that, I was very troubled. I said, whatever that is, I don't want it for my daughter.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons I gave up and asked the Lord, and I just said, if there's a God out there, you've got to do something. But I'm at this little church, or big church, I guess, in this big town. And I don't remember what he taught. I don't remember anything about that place except the light and the bright and the love. But as I was leaving the church, they were handing out free books. And the books were Secular Humanism in the Light of the Holy Scriptures. I went, whoa, they know about secular humanism too. Maybe I can find out what this is. Now that I think about it, that was quite a synchronicity, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I picked up that book. It was by Homer Duncan of Lubbock, Texas. And I still remember. I don't know who Homer Duncan is, but I took that book home and I read it and I went, wow. I know I don't want secular humanism, but this other thing, the Holy Scriptures, now that makes sense. I mean, the way he explained it, I said, that makes sense. That's what I want. So I began trying to find answers and ultimately ended up at a little tent revival. I don't know if you know what a tent revival is, but
I've heard of them because it used to happen back home in India, but I haven't been to one.
Well, because I lived in the Midwest in a very small town and the churches were very small, a couple times every summer, some evangelist would come through town and they'd put up a tent out on the outskirts of town and they'd bring in a musician and he'd sing and this revivalist would preach and people would walk down to the front and give their lives. And so I thought that's how it must be done. So that's what I did. But I don't think I fully understood what I did at that point, but I got into a Bible study and got into some small groups and had a wonderful pastor who kind of took us by the hand and taught us in depth God's word and gave me a good foundation. So that's how I got started. But I was 30 when 32, I guess, by the time that all happened. And I'm 72 now, so it's 40 years ago.
Well, I think 30 is probably a good age to actually, because the commitment you're making at the age of 30. Like when I was probably like 12 or 13, I have no idea what I was doing at all. If you make it that young and you get into a church which isn't good, you can become disillusioned. Yes. And you haven't really understood stuff, then you may end up making wrongful connections of Christianity with the practices or the wrongdoings of a particular church. And of course, all churches, there's no perfect church, but like a wantonly abhorrent church, which is just preaching, I don't know, prosperity gospel or something like that. And you make those connections early on. You make those connections early on, and it's going to be very hard to, and before you've understood the entire metaphysical structure, not the entire metaphysical structure, but the basic tenets of why Christianity. So it's good that 30 is a very good age, I would say.
Yeah, because I think if you're that young, it's easy. We teach the kids. I think it's a mistake to teach Bible stories to children.
Yes.
Because they grow up and they think, oh, I know what that is. I've heard that. But they only know this children's version and they're inoculated and they're not interested in hearing that. I mean, I know my daughter's that way. She's not interested in hearing what it really means. Yeah. Jonah is not just a children's story about a guy falling in the water and getting swallowed by a fish. And so they lose the intent and the deeper meaning of it. And so I think we all have to come. So did you come back at some later stage, or did you just stay faithful from the time you were 12?
I stayed faithful. I would never say I stayed faithful to God in any shape or form. And I don't even say that facetiously. I could know, there are so many things which could shake my faith. If literally aliens came onto Earth, I don't know, where my faith in Christianity, all my metaphysical questions about God, secularism, those would remain. But I think it would be very hard for me, in the light of aliens or someone showing macro evolution literally happening in a lab, where species morph into other species. My faith would be, I don't have that firm of a faith that it would not be shaken by something.
So why would that shake your faith? That's interesting to me.
So definitely with being off topic of emergence completely, but for sure, in terms of why aliens, I don't know. A few Christians I've spoken to have shared my sentiments on this, but a lot of the metaphysical resonance that Christianity has in Christ's sacrifice on the cross has for me, in particular, is the fact that it was so special and not a fractal, diffuse event which keeps happening on multiple different planets across time. The fact that God in his narrative structure, chose this one moment for this to happen for the rest of eternity and for all of history and just for the entirety of the known universe, it really metaphysically resonates with me. And I link that very deeply with other metaphysical realities and laws which God has instituted, like monogamy. Otherwise, that and and like the relationship between a husband and wife being some reflection, a pale reflection, albeit, but a reflection of God's love for us. So that the specialness of Jesus' death and also the magnitude of his death on the cross would be diminished greatly if it was some sort of just another cosmic process which happens on multiple planets. And also, if I saw aliens, I would, again, maybe I would still have all the questions about that I still have in terms of the metaphysics, but maybe I'd revert to a more deistic belief in God. And maybe I would not believe so much in the goodness of God, or in that sense. I would just, it would be, I don't know, I don't know if I'm putting this across in any comprehensible way, but it would greatly, like, it would change my perspective on God. If we were to,
I've heard a lot of people say that, but it's always been a little bit of a puzzlement to me. But maybe because I haven't studied physics to any great extent, I don't need to have some sort of perfect understanding of the physical substructure of the universe to believe that there is the all-powerful God that created all of this and gave himself as a sacrifice because he wanted to redeem me, and he wanted to redeem everybody that would, that wanted to be redeemed. Not everybody wants to be redeemed, probably, but if you know you need a redeemer, he's there, and he loves us. And to me, it doesn't matter whether that's in this universe or another universe or on this planet or another planet. He is who he is. He's big enough for all of it. I mean, he's so far above and beyond our comprehension. It seems to me that the more we learn about how big the universe is, and now they're saying that the part that we can see, the 14 billion years across, may only be 1% or less than 1% of what's actually there. And even the physicists don't know what's outside the part we can see. The known part is where the light extends to, and beyond that, they don't know what's there. That's how big it is. And it looks that big when you look inside a single cell and you start looking deeper and deeper inside that cell and what makes up that cell. So it doesn't matter to me whether maybe all the cells in my body are all planets. How do I know? It doesn't matter to me how it works out and where he is in all of that. But obviously it's so big and so amazing that it has to come from him. And there is this, now when you were talking about this one point in time, absolutely. I totally resonate with that, because I have this chiastic structure in my mind. You've heard of chiastic structures. When they wrote the Hebrew Bible, they were using this poetic structure for writing, that very oftentimes you can read a passage and you'll see a statement, and that statement will be repeated in another form, like 20 verses later or 40 verses later. And then after that statement, there'll be another statement that's repeated here, and then repeated here and here, and then eventually the center point. So that structure is kind of like an X or a cross. And this chiastic structure shows up all through the writings in the Hebrew, and it also shows up in the New Testament in the way many of the stories are told. And on a larger scale, when you look at the story of Joseph, for example, you can see how his life started out very large. He was the favored son. He had the coat of many colors. Everybody was going to bow down to him. but his life began more and more and more constricted until finally he's thrown in prison and he has no hope. But then he comes out of prison and his life gets bigger and bigger and bigger until he's ruling all of Egypt. So that's also this kind of chiastic structure, and it shows up everywhere. Well, it also shows up in Jesus, right? Because all of the Old Testament is telling us about him and leading to him. And then he comes, and then from his coming, it percolates out into the whole vast, world. Yeah, it's like the good infection getting into people and growing and changing not only human beings, but changing cultures and changing philosophies and all of that. Well, I don't understand why that principle couldn't be built into the universe. I mean, it's here. It can also be universal. So, I mean, to me,
But
there's no conflict.
okay, so there's so much I want to address. Like I've been trying to see if I can. And so let me start with this chiastic structure. So again, in Jesus' life, so Jesus, he starts off, of course, with God,
Mm-hmm.
Alpha and the Omega. And then we have the point of his crucifixion, and then we have it spreading all over the world, the good infection, as you say. But then again, if we are to believe the scriptures, there is going to be a change there. So we then do get an asymmetry. In terms of symmetry, we get an asymmetry because there's going to be Armageddon. So it's going to come back. There's going to be, I don't know how that event or how it's going to look, but there's going to be first the perversion of the world, which we are, of course, witnessing, I don't know, early or late signs of now.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's going to be Judgment Day, and then there's going to be some other. So for me, I do believe that there is this fractal nature in the world. But in terms of the hierarchy of how things go, I think the narrative, because we have this structure, but doesn't form a perfect X afterwards, because there's some shifting in what flows after the event of his crucifixion. So that it's not that everything is just fractal, which is kind of what an Eastern or a pagan religion, without using that as a derogatory term, would kind of suggest that everything, any specifics that you observe at a local level, if you zoom out, it will just merge into a uniform, homogeneous, but a uniform structure, which explains away the specificity. But in my view, God actually has, and that's kind of like the scientific part of the scientific mindset, is to try and explain away specificity or arbitrariness. But I think God is like, partly he's both a god of the structure, but he's the master of the structure and the chiastic structure and the fractal nature. And above all that, he is a God who has like a narrative too. And then his narrative and his specifics predominate over any uniformity or any structure. So that is where for me the clash arises between, again, going back to the aliens, if just the specificity of God creating humans in his image. Of course, it's not a question of God's power. It's more a question of me looking and trying to see if God has created us in his image. I'm trying to see what parts of me what parts of me are true, and all humans are truly the deepest and which resonate the most with his nature, and try and see. And for me, on an aesthetic, metaphysical level, aliens existing in other places would really jar with my conception of God being not just a God of fractals and of all these patterns, but a God of narrative and a God of specificity, where he can, because we humans can apprehend patterns, so we can, lest we boast about our own knowledge, we can apprehend structures, we can apprehend principles, we can apprehend, but we cannot beyond, which is amazing, because we can apprehend beyond rules. We can actually apprehend principles which cannot even be written as a rule. But God is a God beyond all of that, in my view, where he is the master of all these things. These are all just principalities below him, order, structure, but he's the master of all of this, and we cannot apprehend it. Similar to the way he has arbitrary rules, like don't eat from that tree. We can't understand that by any principle, Of course, we can try and give rationalizations for that, but we'll never be able to apprehend God in that manner. And in that way, for me, it just doesn't, it jars with me. But there are Christians that I know, like you, who have no problem with the alien thing. And again, it's not that I think you're wrong or right. It's just that for me, it jars with my senses. And I would just shake my faith.
I'm just wondering what you think of when you think of an alien. It almost sounds as though when you think of alien, you're thinking of one of those snake
green men.
or green men or something. And
yeah. I mean, possibly. Definitely, if I saw that, I would have major questions. But even if I were to see life on another planet, the nascent stages of life and evolution itself would jar with my senses. Like if humans were the product of evolution and all the, again, Pastor Paul would say, when I say brutality and when I say perversion, whose standards am I using? God's standards or my own? Am I saying I know better than God? I get all that, but just on a metaphysical level, for me, just thinking that humans are the product of all of this brutality and all of this crap for survival, it just doesn't sit well with me. So if I saw the nascent stages of evolution on another planet with bacteria or morphing into fungi, it would give me questions, and not about God, but about which God. It would give me questions about which religion, as in Christianity itself would lose its prime position in my life. And that's just my honest. So again, all of this stem back to you asking, how long have you just been faithful since then? And this is just to give you, this had all been one big offshoot of that. I'm saying that I don't know if I don't know I don't put any credence in my faithfulness, and that's not a facetious statement.
It's refreshing to hear how honest you are with your thought process. I really love that. I mean, the fact that you're willing to explore these questions, you're willing to think about them, you're so honest about it. I mean, that God loves that kind of honesty. So
honestly, I don't know how some people go through life. It's not even a judgment on them either, but it's just, I'm really curious as to how you could go through life not caring about these questions. And I'm not talking about people who are in desperate circumstances. I'm just talking about people with leisure time. Why wouldn't you think about this stuff? Like what more?
I think you'll find Cy Gart's conversation really interesting, because he was an atheist up until he was 50 years old as a scientist. And it was actually his science that brought him to see more and more, to have more and more questions as he dug deeper into biochemistry and dug deeper into the questions regarding biology or the origin of life. The questions just got bigger and bigger for him until he realized that there had to be more. But God's way of reaching him was also very unique. So I think you'll really enjoy the conversation.
Yeah, I started this thing I think probably like 5 or 6 minutes in, and he just started talking about his divergence from his father as a biochemist as opposed to a chemist. And that's where I'm at.
He says that's his little rebellion. I'm like, yeah, that's about as small a rebellion as you can have, right?
And his dad was probably like, oh, son, biochemist? How dare you? And then in his mind, he's like thinking, yeah, he thinks he's rebelling. Let him have his little rebellion. I don't know.
Does your family live here, or does your family?
Yeah, my family actually should be here any moment. My family being my mom, my dad. I'm here in Regina currently with mom and dad. Just as what does Jordan Peterson call them? The buckos.
Do you have any siblings?
Yeah, I have a brother. He's in Toronto. Yeah.
Toronto seems to be the epicenter of the search for meaning, right?
Mm-hmm. In different both in terms of the IDW or what, I don't know what we would term this. I think people have termed it the intellectual deep web.
Yeah, well, I think originally Eric Weinstein said the intellectual
dark web.
I think that's a misnomer, really. Probably not the wisest thing to call them.
No, I think John Bavecki retermed this small pocket of the internet, the intellectual deep web. I think his little pocket.
I was also kind of tickled by your comment about Jordan Peterson when you said as soon as he makes that statement about the Tower of Babel being too big to fail, he should have seen his own project of how far can you go with this?
Yeah.
Being a problem.
Yeah.
But after you said that, I thought, not necessarily so, because yes, there is a way in which when he tells that story about taking up your cross and struggling up the hill to the city of God, there is a sense in which that sounds like you're trying to make it on your own. But I think there's also another sense in which the church got off track in the last 100 years or so with this idea that, what Bonhoeffer struggled against in a lot of his writings.
1 second. Yeah, sorry about that.
Do you need to go now?
No.
I don't want to. Oh, okay.
I was just opening the door.
Oh, okay. I didn't want to keep you unnecessarily long. But, Bonhoeffer talked about cheap grace, and that just because you say you believe, that's not enough. You really, your belief is manifested in your actions. So I kind of think that's part of what Jordan Peterson is talking about. We don't know how far it can go if we're obedient to the calling, and if we follow through on responsibilities, and if we live up to our own values. Because how do we really know what God made us capable of if we never step into that reality? We create reality in front of us as we make choices. Every choice that we make manifests reality. Otherwise there wouldn't be a future. So as I make a choice, that reality becomes true right in front of me. And so when I make the right choices, when I make the ethical choices, when I make the responsible choices for me and for my family, and then the reality that's manifesting where I go is a good reality. So I don't think it's necessarily I'm going to save myself. I don't think his story is just I'm going to save myself. I think there's more to his story than that. I think he also understands the need for the Redeemer. I know he won't acknowledge it, but I also know I don't know if you heard the conversation that he did with Paul Vanderklay way back when.
I might have heard it, but I don't quite remember the specifics of
Yeah, I had listened to it like 2 years ago, and then I went back and listened to it again last week, and I was kind of blown away. He talked more openly to Paul than he's talked to a lot of people, which doesn't really surprise me because Paul has that effect on people. But he talked about how he said, there's a fair number of atheists that are really angry with me. There's also a fair number of Christians that are really angry with me. And I think it's kind of good to be in that space where everybody's angry with me, because that way they'll listen to me. Where if one side or the other identified him as part of their team, then the other team wouldn't listen to anything. And I think he feels like he has something he needs to say. Did you ever read Maps of Meaning?
I started reading it. Honestly, I couldn't get through it completely.
Well, the only way I was able to get through it is that because of my background in art, and I was studying the elements and principles of design and art and creativity, there's something about that language that all of a sudden kind of mapped over onto his language. And even though his language is very complex and obtuse sometimes and so difficult, all of a sudden I could understand it. It wasn't easy. I think it took me 4 months the first time I read it. And then the second time I read it, it probably took me less time. And now I'm reading it for the third time. And I'm just finishing it up for the third time. And every time I get more out of it. But in that book, he's laying out a thesis of what it's going to take to turn the world around again, because we've gotten on the wrong path. And we've created all this darkness around ourselves, and all the nihilism and all of that. And what it's going to take to turn that around is something he feels like he needs to tell the world. And I think that may very well be something that God gave him to tell the world. I'm not saying he has that picture of himself. I don't think he necessarily thinks, oh, I have this mission from God. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm just saying when I watch where he came from and what the linchpins were that shot him more and more and more into the public eye, that all seemed to be God's hand to me. That didn't seem to me to be man's hand that made him more and more famous. I don't think there's anything a man could do to make himself that famous. That seemed to me to be the work of something more powerful than man. And that means to me that what he has to say is something that I should pay attention to.
Of course, pay attention, of course. But just in terms of the initial quote, where he went in, the one that I was referring to was when he was actually talking about humanity itself. Like, this was kind of his the way he substituted this was in reference to the resurrection. So this was kind of his version of what the resurrection. And this was in response to someone asking him whether Jesus rose from the dead, and he said, if we actually got our acts together collectively, who knows? Again, this was kind of a punting answer that he gave, but who knows how far we can take this? Of course, there is the reading that you gave into it is possible, plausible, but just if I were to take it at the most
not to take the place of the resurrection, though, right? Yeah, I see what you're saying.
He kind of said that in response to that question, in response to resurrection. So, and of course, he wasn't even answering the question of Jesus' resurrection, but he kind of answered the question of resurrection itself from that question. He punted on the resurrection of Jesus himself, and then was kind of alluding to our own resurrection. And the only way I could possibly see us all getting our acts together and resurrecting ourselves would be in some sort of artificial computer synthesized manner. So and regardless, the sentiment behind it itself is dubious in my opinion. Of course, I'm not saying I'm not complete. I don't deny any of the wisdom he has in terms of the other things he says, but here and there I do find I don't know, discrepancies in what he says as far as
he almost always front loads everything he says with the demur that I'm only speaking psychologically. He said, I'm not denying that there's more than the psychological level. There are many levels to this, and I'm not denying any of them. But when I speak, I'm only speaking psychologically. So if I take him at face value there, and I think about only at a psychological level, is there some sense in which we experience a rebirth of our psyche, or a rebirth of our hope, or our capacity to achieve? Is there some way in which there is a psychological level of that's aside from the resurrection of Christ? Yeah, I don't know. That's questionable. I got a chance to hear Dr. James Tour a couple of weeks ago in person. Do you know who he is?
No.
Oh, you'll like him a lot. You will really like this guy, James Tour. Tour. There's all kinds of stuff on YouTube of him talking. But he's one of the foremost scientists in synthetic chemistry and nanotechnology.
Okay.
And he's been a believer since he was in college. And he said his faith and his understanding of God's word is what has guided all of his science, and he has achieved amazing things. But when he talks about what it means to believe, he strictly used that verse from Ephesians 2, 8 through 10. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So he says that belief in the resurrection is the one key.
Yes.
And that seems to be the sticking place for Jordan Peterson. And that's hard for all the materialist scientists. And Jordan Peterson, to be fair, is not a materialist scientist, but there's enough of the everything has to be verifiably, empirically testable hypothesis kind of stuff in him that that the resurrection is a tough one for him.
And I wouldn't even put that on his shoulders. Like I've often said, even like personally, like for me, how deeply do even I believe in the resurrection as a physical event? Because like, do I believe it the same way? Are my actions the same as they would have been had I actually seen it happen right in front of my eyes, physically in person? Or is my belief not as strong as that? Do my actions not reveal that level of faith? So even and Jesus himself kind of alluded to there being gradations of faith, saying faith as small as a mustard seed. So even if it's not the most faith, it's definitely not. I definitely even I don't think anyone in the modern world really has. I mean, maybe a few stray cases who believe with the same level as if they had actually seen it unfold in front of their eyes. And I think we see that in the amount of suffering that the apostles were willing to endure. That it was literally witnessing that in front of their eyes, which could give them that level of faith and certainty in what lay in store for them beyond the grave, for them to endure such massive pain. And even so, even after, and yeah, because even before the resurrection, Peter, who had witnessed all of Jesus' miracles, still denied it. So the resurrection is definitely key in all of that, in faith.
Well, for the rest of us, I wonder how much of it kind of grows on us. I'm thinking back to when I first made a commitment to be a follower. I don't think I had this tremendous, powerful, unshakable faith in the resurrection. I don't really think I did. But it's over time, as I have experienced the life of Christ in me and through me, and teaching and guiding, and occasionally those moments of absolute transcendent power. Those are very occasional because you can't live there. I mean, you're completely undone when it happens, so you can't move. That you can't live at that level. But those moments, there's absolutely no question to me now that Jesus Christ is alive. I can't doubt it. So, but it was a growing thing. I don't think it was an instantaneous thing. And so one of the things I really dislike about evangelical Christianity is this trying to pin everybody down. You know, you have to say this, you have to say that, and you're going to believe this, we're going to put you in that box. And everybody needs to have space to walk their walk and experience their path, because it's through the suffering that the growth takes place, and it's through the struggle that you learn. And
I don't even fault the evangelical Christians, because again, the way they've set up their church is kind of a response to that, the immediacy and the urgency for people to accept those key points like the resurrection, because they can see how valuable or invaluable those certain beliefs are. So that everything, it's kind of like what Paul was talking about on one of his videos, where he said each version of church is an overcorrection of the church that came before them. So
yeah.
Protestantism was an overcorrection to Catholicism, and all the way up to modern churches, and you can and that's such a resonant point, because you can see that unfold in your own church. Like in my own city, there are so many churches which, like, people saw the hypocrisy and the lukewarmness of like the churches the churches of the likes that I came from, and so the overcorrection was now we're just, and also like kind of the fuddy-duddiness of the older generation who are in charge of the church. So then I saw, like, you see this whole offshoot of young churches with literally just young people, and then you see that was an overcorrection of the previous thing.
Yeah.
And then so in that way, similarly, but slightly tangentially, evangelical churches are just overcorrection of people. Probably before them, people were just kind of getting fuzzy on all of those beliefs and things. And of course there are so many churches where all of those key points aren't stressed enough, and they kind of get lost in the hustle. So that's probably like, no, we got to return to that. So again, overcorrections all over the place, overcorrections, and this compounds upon each other.
I had years ago when I went as a missionary to Japan, I met some other missionaries. One of them was a couple that were going to go to London as missionaries, and he had a theory that all of the denominations come each time someone has an experience with God and God reveals an aspect of his character, they think, oh, this is it. And so they develop a denomination around it. And then they make their own little club. And now we're all going to believe this. But then someone else has a revelation of another aspect of God's character. And instead of the first group saying, oh, yes, we want that too, they say, no, that's you. This is us. And then that guy starts his own little tribe. And every time somebody has a new revelation of God's character, they start another tribe. But human beings are funny. We are really funny creatures.
Rumor has it one of those offshoots of the church is the reductionist scientist, just another offshoot. Where they're stressing the aspect of God's orderliness and predictability. That extends all the way down.
It's what Sygart said this morning when he said the faith of atheism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you can clearly see it. Just anyone who's done any mathematics or any physics realizes that it takes a lot of faith to even do that. And honestly, that is what I lacked. I just lacked a lot of faith in the math, like when I was studying, because anytime you get a maths problem thrown in front of you, I'd see people who had a lot more faith in the axioms that were given before, like do a lot better and do it much faster than me. Because they'd be like, the teacher would just throw down these axioms, throw down these rules, and they'd be like, oh, cool. I guess those are the rules, and we're going to operate under them. And meanwhile, I'd just be like, but why these rules? Why these particular rules? Meanwhile, they'd all gone to like 5 problems down the line. And even like when you're doing a maths problem, you always have, when you get stuck at a certain point, you have this huge vista of possible ways forward that open up to you. And I wouldn't intuitively like narrow those down. I'd want to explore all of the pathways, and that's probably not the best way to make quick strides in. So there's a lot of faith for sure in mathematics and science. So that goes without question.
Arul the rebel. I guess that's where. So I would love to talk again sometime. If you have some other things that you'd like to toss around, let me know.
Yeah, for sure. This was a great conversation.
Otherwise, is it okay with you if I publish this?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, great. It's been so good talking to you, Arul.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.